Nan, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited about this interview. I was looking at your LinkedIn and I was really curious about your background because it looked like you were like CTO at Everlane for a while, then you were like had this shift into product and design for a little bit where you were advising some companies on it, and now you're like head of product. Were you formerly an engineer and then also like a product manager? Like, how did you cross all those worlds?
Yeah, I'm sure you have a very similar kind of experience where if you work at a small startup, you end up wearing every single hat like that's
Oh yeah.
available, basically. Like
Oh yeah.
whatever needs to get done, you're kind of taking care of it. I have a computer science background. I started off doing engineering work at investment banks, actually. And then I moved into startup land where I ended up taking on a lot more different kinds of responsibilities. When I was CTO at Everlane, I was basically managing engineering, product, and design all at the same time. And I think the product side of it really spoke to me. I think part of it was like the leverage that product managers can have, but also, in all honesty, I just saw so many. I saw it done incorrectly or badly in so many different situations that part of me was like, I really need to just get in there and try to see if I can solve this myself. I had some concept of, I think I know where this stuff is falling down, and I have some theories about how it might be better. And people seem to have been receptive to that idea, so I'll just leave it at that.
That's awesome. Yeah, I'm right there with you. I come from a design background and fell in love with design, absolutely eat it up. I'm like a design IC as well as leading products. So I'm in it every single day and I love it. But then I found the product side of things and I'm like, okay, this takes it to another level, because if you pair product and design or product and engineering, either one really, you're taking the conceptual and strategic role of product with your tactical building skills and being able to actually bring an idea or a strategy to life, which is like intoxicating. It's so much fun. And then as of this last year, I'm also moving into engineering as well, which has been a fun new journey. I want to jump in with what most people who know Linear are curious about, which is, how does Linear dog food their own products?
The sort of tried answer to that is we use it every day, right? Like every person at the company uses Linear to some degree. But I think we don't do, which I know a lot of companies like do this when they try to dog food their own products, is we don't try to like force fit Linear into use cases that it's not really well suited for. And I think that like you could imagine situations you're like, oh, it's like a task management system. So for every possible use case that is maybe slightly shaped like that, you'd want to dog food Linear. And we typically don't do that. We try to be honest with ourselves and make Linear actually earn its sort of place in our workflows, even internally at the company. But I think luckily we've hit the nail on the head enough so that every sort of department at the company uses Linear to some degree.
And I know we've talked before on the phone, and you've mentioned that the suggestions and feedback that you get from customers through Slack channels or Twitter or any other mechanisms that y'all have in place gets funneled through into the different Linear comments or issues in order to consolidate those things in one place. Do y'all still do that, or is there a different way that y'all track feedback?
Yeah, basically described our process. We have a lot of integrations with things like Zendesk and Intercom. So a lot of the inbound requests and the comments and feedback and complaints and stuff like that eventually makes its way to an issue within the system in one way or another. We also do the same kind of thing with the other support channels we have, like Slack, and we have a pretty active customer community. It's like a dedicated Slack instance. So we're always linking feedback and messages from those channels into Linear issues as well.
Does the feedback have any sort of upvote mechanism within the issue itself in order to move something up the chain of priority? Or is priority kind of a manual process that's based off gut instinct from the team, and you just use the feedback to inform that process? How does that work?
It's probably closer to the latter. If we have enough sort of resolution where something keeps coming up over and over again, like a list of associated customer comments for a particular issue just gets very huge, it becomes fairly obvious, but it's binary in that way, right? Either it's there to inform, hey, when we do get around to building this feature or to making this improvement or whatever it is, let's make sure we take into consideration everything that we've heard. Or it's like, hey, like so many people are talking about this, we really ought to like think about prioritizing it. So it's binary. There's no gradated like sort everything by number of times it's been upvoted by people or anything like that. It's like a two-step process.
Yeah. And I think that plays in very well to Linear's overarching approach to building product as well, because there's always seems to be this balance in taste and like almost design instinct or product instinct balanced with the kind of hard scientific features that are just required to make a product work well. And I've really appreciated that balance in the way that product has been built. And so to dive into that aspect, I want to zoom out a little bit and talk about the vision for the company. Linear is taking on some giants in the space. Jira, Asana, these companies are tens of billions of dollars and are used by virtually every product building company on the planet. It feels almost like a solved issue, and yet the popularity of Linear has proved that it isn't. So what is the vision behind Linear that drives it to create a product in a red ocean, so to speak, and do it so well?
Yeah, there's a lot of things to consider. I say this with complete honesty, right? We have a lot of respect for what Atlassian has done over the course of that company's lifetime. They effectively built out this particular space, right? Jira is like a de facto standard for a lot of people's experience, and no one ever got fired for installing Jira, right? Like this is like a very normal thing for people to do. With any kind of incumbent like that, like they're always going to look like they have a sort of market dominant position if you want to try to compete with them. And I think it's been tempting for a lot of startups to try to compete with Jira, right? If you ask engineers on the ground, like the app is starting to show its age, right? I don't know exactly what their NPS is, but if you look at like a incumbent with a big market cap with relatively low NPS amongst day-to-day users, it's like a particular market that it's appealing for a certain kind of business to want to try to figure a way in or try to figure out, like, is there something new we can do in the space? When we think about what Linear's kind of perspective is, I think you have to look at the founders of the company and the sort of people who are early on in terms of developing the app. Like, we all came from a background where we got into software because it was like fun, right? Like we got interested in software before it was like, oh, we make really great six-figure salaries and all that, you'll work at Facebook and Google or whatever and have a great career. Like, we were into this because we were hacking like MySpace pages and making Flash games and screwing around with computers in all sorts of different ways, right? And we're from that kind of generation, and it was fun. And we got into the corporate setting, and all of a sudden it became like really unfun in all sorts of weird ways. So I think like overall, like we think that we could have an opportunity to introduce ways of working and ways of developing software which make it fun again. And I think that there's a real sort of emotional opportunity there for people to adopt Linear.
If you fast forward, let's say 10 years, maybe even 5 years into the future, how do you see Linear's changing the landscape of product development, in the sense that what is the utopian vision, so to speak, of Linear achieving their vision?
Yeah, I don't want you spending your entire day in Linear, right? Like that would be like a real kind of failure mode for us if somebody just spent their entire life managing issues here and there. So I think the utopian vision is that a lot of people who use Linear don't even know they're doing it. There's a big piece of what we're trying to do to make it pretty transparent in terms of just like people are interacting with this system of record over like what needs to be done and what kind of work is being done at the company and how software is being developed. That lets people focus on their actual jobs and the stuff they're experts in, the stuff that they're interested in, without focusing on all of the meta work. So a lot of the decisions that we're trying to make are trying to minimize the footprint of Linear in people's actual day-to-day lives.
That's such a beautiful, or I think for good design as well. Good design disappears, so does good products. Products that actually do the work for you and fade into the background and allow you to focus on other things is a really cool vision for it. Seems to fit well. I want to transition into the Linear method because it actually dovetails beautifully. The Linear method seems to cut through the fluff of the industry. We've built up this persona, this product manager persona, in a way that says you have to have this sort of process, this sort of framework. You have to organize the tasks really well and have this great Kanban board or prioritization system or whatever. And in reality, what we're trying to do is build software or whatever product, you can fill in the blank. And we need to get from point A to point B, from ideation to production ready code, in as short amount of time as possible and do it efficiently. So one of my favorite parts of the Linear method is they say write issues clearly in plain language instead of using user stories. And harkens back to this day when it was important to translate non-technical user feedback into technical or something. But these days, everybody knows what a notification is. Everybody knows what a login screen is. And so you could just say, build a login screen, and that's going to be enough to provide direction and boundaries for your engineering team. And it cuts through the bullcrap of the industry. What is the impact of the linear method on Linear's growth and adoption with people? Because I just have a feeling it resonated so strongly with people, not just myself.
Yeah, and you raised a good point about like the timing matters, right? There was a moment in time in the sort of practice and history of software development where like user stories might have made a lot of sense because people were really wrapping their heads around this idea of translating like business requirements into actual working software. And one of the things you point out is you're like, look, a lot of these patterns exist already. You can just say do the pattern instead of trying to indirectly tell people that you want the pattern, right? The user ought to be able to like input their email and password in order for them to authenticate. So, okay, you want a login script. Thank you. And the linear method is related to that, right? There's a lot of words that get thrown around in our industry a lot, like agile and sprint and epic and ninjas and all that kind of stuff. And we created those words partly to brand some of these ideas, but like the more you brand it, the more they take on a life of their own. And I think we're at a point now where everyone knows how these things work. And that gives us an opportunity to simplify the language and simplify the communication back down to what are you actually trying to get done? Because we think back to the original point that like software development and writing code and designing and things like that, like those are really interesting, deep, fun activities already. You don't need to make it more fun by calling people ninjas. That's not a thing that you need to do. And I think the linear method is really about just like setting up a framework for people to retain their focus and put it back onto the actual like task at hand.
There's been other companies, I believe Basecamp is one of the others that I can think of off the top of my head, that's written a sort of manifesto that says this is the way that we view the world and why we're building software this way. And I think the goal of the manifesto has always been to attract the sort of people that see the world through the same lens that you do. Has Linear had a really visceral response from the community through the linear method? Or is the linear method more of an internal playbook, so to speak?
I think it's, as much as anything, it's a sort of framework for people to understand how the software is designed to work, right? A lot of times, onboarding is really hard because the question that people ask is like, how is this supposed to work? I want to do things like the right way. That's like something that we hear a lot when people kind of adopting linear for the first time. And what we're trying to emphasize is, in your mind, simplify it down to its like most fundamental components, and that's the right way. And I think it's much easier for us to communicate that than to come in with terms that we made up. Hey, we want to own this space. We're going to create this new vocabulary so that people like this is heavily branded and people really associate it with us. It's like we could have taken that approach, but that approach isn't what we actually want, right? We want people to get back to the work. The linear method is a way of expressing that, right? If you're working on a project, it's called a project. That's what it is, and that's it, right? There's no other weird word that we came up to make up for this. It works how you think a project ought to work. Okay, now that you've taken the 5 seconds it takes to learn this, go and actually produce software like you intended to do.
Yeah, and I think that the linear method has caused a lot of people to call Linear opinionated. And I think Linear even calls itself opinionated, maybe on its website somewhere. What are some of the strong opinions that Linear has built into the product itself that maybe people say, wow, it might not be flexible, but this is exactly how it should work anyway?
I think this is going to cause some of our users to feel a certain way because there's two like feature requests we get all the time. And one of them is like custom fields and related to that, required fields, right? Those two kind of come hand in hand. And another one is like multiple assignees to an issue. And so far, we've said basically no to both of those requests consistently over time, hundreds of times. And I think that is a strong opinion because like at the end of the day, we value clarity over almost everything else. We're like, look, like for the day-to-day kind of engineer doing their job, when they have to either create a ticket or close an issue or do some work, like they really need to know what is going on, right? And if they don't know anything at all, right, but they just know who is responsible for this thing, they at least have someone to go to and like figure out, okay, that's my point of contact. I need to talk to them about this, or that's the person responsible. I can rely on them to get it done. Or if that person's me, it's like, okay, it's relying on me to get it done. Those are extremely valuable invariants to hold at scale. And it's worthwhile to sacrifice a lot of flexibility in order to just maintain that promise to every single engineer on the ground. There are disadvantages, right? It's like, oh, sometimes it's these two people working on it together. It's like, I get it. And I think we're thinking through a lot of different solutions to kind of maintain the clarity about, but also let you express those kinds of ideas in the system. But as a starting point, we're always going to prefer clarity over every other trade-off.
And one of the things that I believe you and I have talked about before is when you have a custom field, let's say, people might create a million different fields, muddy up the water of the issue. But if there's something that's recurring, everyone would love to create this particular custom field, then maybe that's an indication for Linear to build a feature set around that problem that they're having that is made a first-class citizen of the product, as opposed to it being this hacky custom field solution for it. Am I on target with that?
Yeah, I think that's one of the approaches that we've taken to field these kinds of requests, right? There are things that are first-class citizens of Linear that we think are important, just broadly speaking, for most issues, and those things we're like happy to kind of add them to the feature set. The problem with custom fields is sort of twofold, right? Like the first one is like what you said, like people had a million of them, and then now you have no idea which ones are actually needed for a particular issue versus another one. Oh, it's a security issue versus like a bug fix. Do they have the same custom? But there's all sorts of configuration and sort of tribal knowledge that everybody needs to know. And then the second problem is people then start using the hammer of, they'll make some of them required. And then you invariably have this field is required, but it's actually not applicable to the thing at hand. So I'm going to put in some kind of placeholder, meaningless value to it. And then your data quality just goes down the tubes. So our kind of perspective has always been like when we see other tools building these kinds of things, usually what's motivating it is there's some kind of like reporting need, right, from a management layer or above or whatever it is. And they're like, hey, like I want to be able to understand my issues from this like perspective. And in order to do that, I'm going to force down the tedious work of doing the data entry on everybody, right, on everyone who's like doing the day-to-day stuff. And we've taken the inverse approach, right, which is that let's really make sure that we're always focusing on making everyone's day-to-day experience like really excellent. And that's the way you're going to get good data quality, right? And we get this feedback from customers all the time, which is, oh yeah, for the first time, I can actually rely on the issues to be like correct and up to date. And it's because the actual cost of filling in an issue, it's like people understand why doing whatever data entry is actually necessary is actually going to add value to their life. And then they're motivated to do it. And then from that foundation, you can actually have reporting that's useful. You can have very nicely structured reporting that is bad data quality and it's just garbage in, garbage out. And we're just like, let's avoid that situation, right? Let's make sure the data quality is always good by making the day-to-day experience really excellent. And then we can solve the sort of reporting problems like independently.
I love that you mentioned that because y'all just released Insights, which is this gorgeous reporting feature built right into Linear. Let's talk about the process from idea all the way through to production and kind of walk me through how product gets built at Linear. I think this changes so dramatically from company to company that, at least to satisfy my own curiosity, I just want to know, how did that idea get on the table? What kind of conversations were had around it? How did you get it to design? How did you get it to engineering, et cetera, et cetera?
It's a funny story because this is the first thing I worked on with Linear. I actually started off just as a contract product manager with Linear during the start of this process, where they're like, we keep hearing it from customers. Everyone's like, we need reporting, we need reporting. The ICs are loving all of the day-to-day work, but the managers are feeling like they're flying blind here. And we need to be able to understand the numbers behind a lot of these things. And everyone on the team says, okay, so clearly there's a need for some kind of reporting, but we don't want to be in the business of building like a complete BI tool on top of our existing system that's taking on so much scope, right? We also don't want to be building really underpowered tools that tick a box. Okay, you can buy Linear now. It's got reporting because it says so on the feature matrix. But then people use it and it has an outrageously steep learning curve, or they just don't find it useful, right? We wanted to avoid those things. And that's why I was originally brought in, right? We wanted to do a lot of research about what kind of reporting do people actually want to be doing out there. We took feedback from different customers who are asking for it, different sales conversations that we had where people expressed this as a requirement. We read a lot of papers on what kind of, there's like books written about like reporting on agile development processes and things like that. And what can we take away from this that we think is like valuable? What are the core concepts? So there was a pretty extensive like research process. And even by the time I had landed on this particular project, the team had already done a lot of like user interviews and stuff. So they had a lot of video and notes and things like that to review. Before we started development on it, we like felt like we understood like really the sort of key problems that we were trying to solve in the space. And the sort of design process for it was really about like simplifying that down to, okay, like what is the minimum set of things that we can do to actually solve these things? And we're not trying to be overly minimal. We don't want to be austere about it. If you look at Insights, there's a lot of features in it, but we wanted to like center on like key principles that make people really want to use reporting features. And where we landed was a lot of it was like, people want to know where they're spending their effort. They want to know where the team is spending their attention. That's like one major like locus of where those requirements ended up coalescing around. Another one was they wanted to know how long things generally took. Right. And then the sort of variant on that is like, hey, if everyone does like estimation, and we all know it's wrong, but how wrong is it? Always wrong. But is it usefully wrong, or is it like random? People want to know that. So this idea about how long do things actually take, right? Presumably every single task management systems can tell you how long things actually take, but like very few of them actually do. And then the third piece was really about data quality more than anything else. Hey, we have this policy where, you know, when a bug comes in, you should try to label it with what customer reported it or something like that. Like we have this sort of soft policy, and sometimes it makes sense, sometimes it doesn't, you know, and it only makes sense for a subset of things or whatever it is. It's a very complicated rule set. I just want to know like how good are we doing in that particular idea, right? Or trying like to run a particular process, how well are we actually achieving the intent of the process? And then you want some kind of reporting to just give you some aggregates about that kind of stuff. So those are the main areas, right, where people are like trying to ask these kinds of questions. And so we're like, okay, let's make reporting that can answer those questions in a way that's like flexible enough, because every company is incredibly different, but also makes a lot of sense within like Linear's ecosystem, right? We could like, hey, we create a new feature, it's a totally different screen, slap it on the side and call it a day. Not really how we want to do things, right? We want to make features that make sense in the context of everything else that kind of existed. So yeah, like those were the main kind of considerations that we had during the sort of initial research and design process. And we had a working version internally very early on, right? Like for us, it's like super important. Dog food the absolute heck out of every single major feature that we develop. Within maybe like a month of development, we had an internal working version that was not nearly ready to go for prime time, but like we could use it to do work and figure out what was good and bad about it. And then we iterated, we went through like a private beta process where we teased it and had signups, and then we went through a public beta process, and we're near the end of that like public beta stage. And we're maybe a couple weeks out from being ready to go to call it like this is done.
So whenever y'all originally started, I know Linear is famous for having engineers and designers working on the problem at the same time. What did that look like in terms of you bringing some insights or someone else bringing some insights from a customer interview to the table and then actually trying to solve that problem? Was it, hey, maybe this is a direction based on this user interview, designer, can you go design something real quick and let's see how that looks? And engineer, is that buildable based on our current stack? What does that conversation look like to involve design and engineering at the same time?
Yeah, I think in order to understand that, you have to understand our sort of staffing profile at the moment. We basically have, in terms of working on the web app and the Electron app, we basically have 2 designers, right? Just at all. And I want to say 20, 25 engineers or something like that. So that's like not a ratio you'd like normally deal with. And I'm at the company, I'm the only dedicated product manager where that's like my entire kind of role, almost as like a forcing function. I have to stay very high level. The designers have to stay pretty high level, right? They're not going to get into the pixels of every single feature that we build or anything like that. And then the product engineers are the ones that are doing a lot of effectively, like a lot of the design work and design decisions as they're iterating on things. So that's something that's a little bit unusual about how Linear works for all intents and purposes. Like it's default collaborative because we literally don't have the bandwidth to do the sort of like full separation of responsibilities like you would normally see.
I love that. So everybody shifts, I guess. Engineers have to also wear a design hat. Design also has to wear a strategy hat. Strategy also has to wear like a business ops hat. And you just have a lot of crossover so that it makes things easier across the board, theoretically.
Yeah, I think in effect, that's what ends up happening. I think in terms of the actual product management and design responsibility, this is the organization in which the engineers hold on the most adjacent responsibilities.
Very cool. I know that your role is a very unique one in the world of product, but I want to dive into it because it fascinates me. Linear is very vocal about building for engineers versus building for product managers, presumably because engineers are the ones actually executing on the work, and they need to be able to take tasks and translate that into what am I supposed to do today? Or designers need to take that task and translate it into what they're doing today. How does your role as a product role insert itself into an organization that is very engineer driven or engineer heavy?
I think the way to think about it is my primary responsibility is to connect different teams to each other, right? Like that's fundamentally what I'm doing. I'm taking like a development team over here and another one over there working on different issues, working on different projects and features and saying, okay, like how do these two lines of development make sense like at the same time or with each other? How do these features interact? Linear is a very like horizontal type of product. There's a lot of different features for different parts of the development process, and they all have to make sense together. No one likes going into a piece of software and they're like, I can see the org chart from this piece of software because this thing and this thing are just totally removed from each other. They look like they were designed by different teams and all that kind of stuff. A big part of what I do is connection and integration, both across dev teams like I described and also up and down, right? Hey, like what's the business strategy? Okay, what does that mean for in terms of the customer segments we're targeting and how does that make sense with what's being developed and what the roadmap looks like? If I'm able to connect the development to the business and teams to each other, then I'm doing a good job.
Very cool. How involved day to day with IC work are some of the co-founders like Thomas and Jory? Are they actually contributing to the engineering, or are they looking to advance the business and kind of staying high level as well?
They're pretty involved. I'd say all of the founders are fairly hands-on in certain moments, right? They're taking on obviously kind of executive type of responsibilities. They are the leaders of the company, so they have to definitely do that piece. But I think Thomas and Jory especially are very hands-on in developing key initiatives like on the ground. I think that they both, I don't know if Jory does very much anymore, but I know Thomas certainly does, and Jory has recently. They both still write code to a large degree and are hands-on working with the team to make sure that certain like really important projects are completed to the level of quality that they want.
What is the process for setting goals at Linear? I know this is one thing that is also outlined in the Linear method, where you back into goals a more strategic way. Just curious to hear your thoughts on that from a product perspective.
Yeah, so I think a lot of companies get into trouble if they try to be just like too goal driven. Like companies doing stuff like, oh, we set OKRs and that kind of that trellises down all the way to like individual contributors, and then people are trying to set their own OKRs and just like shrug and pick a random number because that's the best they can do. So we're trying to like avoid that kind of thing. For us, goals are at the level of managers. The goals are themselves are pretty high level, right? There's like certain customer segments that we're trying to target. There's certain objections that we're trying to get past for things like enterprise accounts and things like that. And so even just with that basic starting point, like we leave it up to the creativity of like the teams to like figure out ways to attack it, right? Like we have to take apart the problem, go to the data a little bit, understand what kind of user behaviors are driving a particular metric or number that we're seeing, and then form some kind of hypothesis around like how we might be able to solve that. And then after that, it's mostly about execution. So I think like with everything else that we do at Linear, it's a fairly like minimal and simple process. We either got the customers or we didn't. We either had good adoption amongst a particular market segment or we don't. These are not things that we need to overcomplicate. And we try to get at these things as directly as we can.
Once again, Linear's cutting through the bullcrap of the industry and getting down to brass tacks. I love it. Let's focus in on the hypothesis building and going back to the data just for a minute. Obviously, you guys have a very active community. A lot of people are vocal about Linear. Are you getting on the phone and calling people for user interviews regularly to try to prove or disprove a hypothesis? Or are you just combing through user feedback that's already coming through other channels? What's the process for making sure the data that you're basing decisions off of is good data?
Yeah. So I have pretty strong opinions about this. I think that you're basically trying to triangulate 3 things, right? Like the first one is a backlog of customer feedback. You have to have a pretty decent way to record that in a way that's structured enough for you to go reference it. I think that there's a lot of interesting things that we're trying out internally that's probably going to make its way into the product at some point, but that's one step that you have to take and make sure you have that really buttoned up. The second thing is like understanding what the strategy of the product and the company is. There's a core strategy that we're taking, right? We're really focusing on the developer persona. making their life really good, adding layers on top of that. That's the strategy. That's not set in stone. We can change that if we want, but with the first kind of pass at asking what should we do is like saying, okay, let's get an understanding of what the customers are saying to us and trying to match that with what the strategy of the company is. And then the third piece is what you're talking about, which is like going out and doing active research around stuff. And I think active research is a little bit dangerous, right? Like people do this, or like I have a hypothesis and they go out and they ask questions that would like lead to, oh yeah, here's why you're correct, right? This is a very like human thing to do. And like you can shake your finger at people and say you should try to be unbiased in your interviews and stuff like that. It's like you can try as much as you want, but it's pretty hard to avoid in some circumstances, especially if you're just really trying to get like an understanding of the details of whatever hypothesis or theory that you're putting out there. But I think a healthy balance is trying to understand that is going to be biased to some degree and then matching that to the company strategy.
So going back to the question about user interviews, how do you do that in a way that is trying to remove as much bias as possible, but also dig into the deep questions around that user interaction in a way that's informative for the team?
Yeah. So without getting too much into like interview theory and things like that, I think one of the things that you want to do is honestly just like acknowledge that it's going to be biased to some. That's the first thing to start with. I'm not trying to minimize the bias here. I'm trying to control it. I'm trying to control the risk of bias. And for example, we're working on like roadmaps right now, right? We're trying to make our roadmaps feature like a lot better. And one of the things that we really ask is like, hey, can you show us how you communicate, how projects in the engineering department are coming along? Show us like what you're actually doing to communicate those things. Like what emails are you sending? What reports are you building? What spreadsheets are you maintaining? All that kind of stuff. And that's good. It's not going to tell us like whether having these kind of high level views are important versus not, right? You have to have some kind of independent theory to describe that. But it'll tell you, like, we're not asking questions about, hey, like, how do you want to improve the roadmaps feature instead of linear, right? Like, we're trying to figure out like what people are doing of their own accord and things like that. So taking that more sort of oblique approach to understanding the topic is probably the go-to tactic that we're trying to do to make sure that we're not just like seeing everything through rose-colored glasses and giving ourselves a lot of confirmation bias.
Love it. I want to wrap up on a question that is very relevant to today's larger conversation around AI. I've seen some AI tools come out for product managers that seem to try to automate or take some of the grunt work out of general PM responsibilities. And Linear is already doing that without AI. And so I'm really curious about the crossover because we're getting to a point where with GPT-4 and other models that are more advanced, there's a lot that AI can do in a way that's very helpful for getting the project management part out of the way and letting people focus on actually building. How are y'all thinking about AI, and what do you think that the role of it in the context of Linear is?
We're definitely thinking about it a lot. When I mentioned that in Promise are hands-on with things, one of the things that Jory is very hands-on with is thinking about our AI strategy and how we want to apply that to the product and to the business. In terms of just like on a theoretical level, how we're thinking about it, like the first thing we have to acknowledge is that things are moving extremely quickly, and any assumptions about what it's capable of doing and what it's not capable of doing can just be completely made obsolete in like a few months. So I think we have to go into it with some level of self-skepticism and sort of humility about that. But the places where we can really use some of these like large language models in a way that's naturally helpful for people is pulling apart the semantics of what people like write in issues and things like that and relating them to other issues, right? That's fundamentally what we're doing. That's one piece. Another piece is if you think about a lot of the interfaces in Linear, what makes it so powerful is effectively we give people ways to do like visual programming in terms of building entry points into their issue database, right? Like what are different ways I can look at this collection of issues, whether it's through insights, whether it's through custom views or filters on projects and things like that. Those are all kind of visual programming interfaces. And a thing that AIs are good at right now is translating natural language into sort of structured language, right? So I think there's a lot of opportunity to give people like easier ways to construct those queries. People like, oh, like I got my AI to write SQL for me. Basically the same thing. I think if you go one step beyond that and you can pick apart issues down to their sort of semantic concepts, you can do stuff like automated deduplication like much better than we're doing today. Every day you think of your product a little differently. You're like, hey, there's a feature taxonomy that's structured in a certain way, or maybe I can think of it from the perspective of different user personas or things like that. And I can try to break apart the semantics of the issue to say, hey, can you organize all of the issues in this area by these 5 different user personas? And that's something where, like, previously, what would you have to do? You would have to, like, at the time where you create each issue, spend some mental effort to, like, tag it according to some dimension that maybe you'll use later, right? There's a lot of this, like, just in case type of admin work that you have to do. And I think one of the most powerful things that AIs open up the possibility to is that it turns that sort of just in case work into just in time work, right? Hey, I have a new idea. Maybe there's a 5th user persona that we weren't considering. Now, can we re-tag every issue according to this new taxonomy? And previously, that would just be like the most annoying thing to ever to do, like, in the universe, right? And now it's like, okay, cool. Just let a computer, like, at least take a first pass at it, right? And then we can just see if there's something that makes sense there. So I think those are near-term obvious opportunities that take advantage of what AIs are good at today, but I don't know what they're going to be good at in 6 months. That's the interesting and scary and fun part of the state of technology right now.
Man, this has been such a fun conversation for me. Getting to see Linear's perspective over the last, honestly, 2 years that I've been watching you guys has been really cool and has informed a lot of the way that I do product. And so getting to talk to you and get some, like, behind the curtain peek at how y'all actually operate has been very cool, even if just for my own curiosity. So thank you so much, man.
Yeah, of course. Great chatting with you.